Today is Saturday. It's the first rainy weekend that we have had since summer began. Autumn is very much on its way, which is very exciting. I just finished reading On Writers and Writing by Margaret Atwood. I didn't quite realize before reading this that this wasn't actually a book about how to write. This is actually a series of lectures that she gave at a university, I think it was, that she kind of adapted into essays, and it's more just musings on the role of a writer, looking sort of academically speaking at what it means to be a writer, why there have been writers throughout history, what is the relationship between the reader and the writer, that kind of thing. I think all of that could have been really interesting, but I didn't find the way this was written very engaging. It read very much like a traditional university essay or like a textbook. Most of it is her referencing other works to sort of show examples of the theme or idea that she is talking about. I just don't personally find that a very interesting thing to read, because I've never found textbooks very useful when it came to my own learning, and I find just reading descriptions or excerpts of other books kind of boring. I wanted to hear Margaret Atwood's own opinions on these topics, or on the topic of writing, and I felt like she was hiding behind this academic structure a little bit, because she clearly didn't actually want to give her own opinion. There were a few really interesting bits at the beginning where she talks about herself as a child and how she got into writing, and she discusses a little bit about the sort of literary history of Canada in terms of when she was a young person. There weren't really any famous Canadian writers, and if you came from a country like Canada that was considered colonial at the time, then you pretty much felt like you had to move to somewhere like London or Paris to be a writer, because writers just didn't come from countries like that. I really wish the book had just been more interesting insights into her own life as a writer, so it was kind of disappointing in that respect. I could definitely see that this would be interesting for people who enjoy a more academic style of book, but if you're looking for some real insights into Margaret Atwood's brain, then this is not going to be particularly helpful. I am currently reading Excellent Women by Barbara Pym, and buddy reading this with Anya from Anya's Bell Jar. This is my first buddy read, if you can believe it, and so far it's been really fun. If anyone else is up for a buddy read, do let me know. I also know that this was one of Yenna's, / Modern Ajama is her channel name, one of her top books from last year, and it started off really interestingly. It's about this woman called Mildred who she's calling herself a spinster and genuinely acting like she's already middle-aged, but she is just over 30. Basically, she's kind of loving life, living by herself, going to church, hanging out with this vicar and his sister, really enjoying the spinster life. And then new people move into the apartment below her, and the first chapter is her meeting Mrs. Napier, who is an anthropologist, and her husband is away in the Navy. Mrs. Napier doesn't go to church and calls herself a slut in the first chapter, which I did look up, and back in the day used to just mean slovenly, but it is very strange coming across that word used so casually. Basically, this woman is everything that Mildred does not approve of. So I have a feeling that Mildred is going to have some character growth throughout the novel. There's definitely a very tongue-in-cheek tone to the book. It is first-person narration from Mildred, so I always really enjoy when we're inside the head of a character, that we're meant to kind of laugh at a little bit and see her flaws while she's also the one telling us the story. I think it's done in a really nice way where she's not a completely ridiculous character. You definitely don't dislike her, but we're definitely meant to pick up a lot of things from the way she's interacting with the other characters. A lot of the reviews for Barbara Pym sort of call her like the 1950s version of Jane Austen, so we will see whether that rings true by the end of the novel. I'm also reading The Professor by Charlotte Bronte almost by accident. I downloaded a bunch of classics from Project Gutenberg, which is that website where you can download ebooks for books that are out of copyright now, which is pretty much any old classic. I just thought it would be good to have some ebooks on my phone. There weren't library ones, so I didn't have like a time limit on when I had to read them, so that any time where I'd normally be scrolling on my phone aimlessly, I would be able to read instead. There's a few different ones I've downloaded, but I did download The Professor and Villette by Charlotte Bronte because Jane Eyre is my favorite book of all time, but I have never completed any of her other novels. I tried to read Villette back when I was a teenager and didn't like it very much, and I tried to read Shirley a few years ago and also could not get through it. I just found her writing outside of Jane Eyre so dry. I was unable to sleep the other night, so I started reading The Professor and have really got into it, which I think just is a reminder that I am a classics girly, as the young people say, at heart. I just love a good Victorian classic. And interestingly, The Professor was written before Jane Eyre. She was never able to get it published, and so sort of just left it and moved on to Jane Eyre, and then used some of The Professor to write Villette. But her husband decided that they would publish The Professor after her death, because obviously she was a really popular writer when she died, so people were very keen for more Charlotte Bronte content. Anyway, really very little is happening in this book so far. It is about a man called William Crimsworth. His parents both died when he was young. His mother's family kind of disowned her because she married beneath her, but feeling kind of guilty that they had neglected her, they decided to help her son get a really great education. So he's just finished this education, but he has decided, because he hates his uncles so much because they're so snobbish and annoying, that he would go into the trade, which his brother has done. So his brother took over their father's trade and is doing really well. He's really successful, but he's definitely not as educated as his brother. So he thinks that he can go to his brother and he will help him out, but of course there's friction between the two of them because the older brother feels like the younger one has risen above his station with this education. The way she describes characters is just very effective. You really get a hold of who they are quite quickly. There's this very unusual, eccentric guy called Mr. Hunsdon who sort of befriends the main character, and the way she describes him genuinely feels like they're about to embark on a love affair together. I know that they won't, but it really feels like they should be. She just uses some really interesting phrases as well. Again, in this book, the word slut is used. William calls his servant a slut, presumably saying that he's slovenly, but it just is so weird reading that in an old book. He also calls himself a shy noodle at one point, and I googled it and I could not find evidence of this being an established phrase, so I don't know whether Charlotte Bronte just made it up, but I just found that so funny. So this book has gone from something that I was just going to dip into every now and then to something that I really want to read because I'm just finding it so enjoyable. And as I say, I just couldn't tell you why. There's nothing in the story to indicate that it should be this fun. It really is that I just love a good classic. Today, as I said, is Saturday, and I think I'm going to go op shopping because that's pretty much what I do every week. Hello, so it is many weeks later and I have finished reading Excellent Women by Barbara Pym. I had so much fun buddy reading this with Anya. It was just really cool to immediately be able to have a discussion with someone who'd also just read the book. I know that's literally the concept of a buddy read, but having never done it before, I didn't realize how enjoyable that is. And it was kind of nice to hear someone have the same kind of reaction to the book as well, because it kind of helped solidify my thoughts on it and also really expand on them probably more than I do when I'm just reading something by myself. As I said before, Barbara Pym had been compared to Jane Austen, and I can see where they're coming from in terms of that Barbara Pym really looks at the minutiae of everyday life. She really focuses on women in British society, and she has a lot of humor and wit in her writing. But in terms of the actual content of the story, it's really not that much like Jane Austen, at least in terms of this book. The way that marriage is treated, the way that the male characters are represented, does not provide the same kind of happy ending that Jane Austen's novels give. This book really is about the way men treat women that they have no interest in marrying, and sort of ironically, the way they treat women that would make particularly good wives, or at least that's the way it's presented in this book, I think. Mildred is incredibly good at housework, at cooking. She's very organized, she's very sensible. If you're the kind of man who wants a wife to do everything for you, as probably a lot of men in the 50s did, and still do now, then Mildred would make the perfect wife. But because she is not vivacious, because she is not pretty, because she doesn't have those qualities that men desire in women alongside all the practicalities, she is completely passed over. And it's often stated by men in her acquaintance that it's better that she stays unmarried in a way, because then she can be of service to all of them at the same time, rather than just be servicing one man as she would if she had a husband. It's really interesting the way this book is digging at that. It's satirizing that concept. It's very accurately displaying how boorish these men are and how ill they treat people like Mildred. But there's also no sense that Mildred can do anything about this or change her situation in life aside from getting married to a man. It really felt entirely observational of the way society was at that time, but not necessarily critical of it, or at least resigned to the way that things were. Anya found a really interesting article that mentions that Barbara Pym wasn't a feminist and that she didn't really like the kind of modern woman that was springing up. And yet it does feel like in this book that she's only a few steps away from feminism. However, interestingly enough, Barbara Pym herself never got married and never had any children, although she definitely had several love affairs according to her Wikipedia page. She ended up living as a spinster with her sister in older life, very similar to Jane Austen, which honestly sounds like a really good deal to me. It's kind of similar to many women who were writers, as if they'd got married and had children, they wouldn't have had any time to actually write novels. I really did enjoy this book. There were parts of it that kind of felt a little bit repetitive, but in a way that made sense because Mildred's life is so repetitive. There's some really almost Dickensian characters in this book, particularly the mother of one of the male characters has this strange obsession with the fact that birds are apparently out to kill everyone. She's also obsessed with worms burrowing into wooden items like furniture. That was probably the most eccentric character. I kind of wish some of the other characters had gone to that level as well, because it was so fun to read. Mildred herself is such an interesting character because she's almost more interesting and thoughtful and intelligent than she gives herself credit for. She's always quoting poetry and having strange little thoughts about things to herself, but she almost dismisses those things because she's so focused on the way that other people see her and has so sort of bound herself to this role as spinster. Anya and I discussed about how the 50s was a particularly conservative period of time, and so for a period like that, I imagine this book is kind of as radical as it was going to get. As an almost 30-year-old spinster myself, any book that is standing up for the single unmarried woman is going to be really interesting to me. I found these male characters so recognizable, and it is a little scary and a little sad that really all of the themes in this book are still so relevant, even in a time when we think that marriage is not compulsory anymore. The older you get, the more ostracized you feel from society if you are not attached to another person. That's just a simple fact that has not changed. I'm quite keen to read some more Barbara Pym. I bought this book on eBay with two other Barbara Pym books called A Glass of Blessings and Some Tame Gazelle. So I'm very glad I have some more Barbara Pym that I can dive into. Just to finish off this vlog, I'm still reading The Professor. It's got to the portion of the book where William Crimsworth, goes to Brussels, which I was expecting because I knew that Charlotte Bronte used parts of this book to write Villette, and I know that Villette is set in Brussels. I'm now remembering one of the reasons I couldn't stand Villette was because so much of it was written in French, and I can't remember whether the version I had any English translations. I'm sure it must have, but maybe they were at the back of the book and all that flipping was annoying me. This is very much the case in The Professor. So much of the dialogue is written in French. They are in Belgium, so they would speak French, but there's literally no reason for Charlotte Bronte to actually write it in French when it's an English book. It just feels like she's showing off about the fact that she can speak and write French. Luckily, because it's an ebook version, I can just highlight and translate each passage, but it does disrupt the reading flow very much. But it's still something I'm reading when I inevitably wake up at 5 AM and can't get back to sleep. I also just started reading Mr. Norris Changes Trains by Christopher Isherwood. This is the first book written from his experiences of living in Berlin. I wanted to read Goodbye to Berlin, as that's the one Cabaret is based from, but this one technically comes first, and so I thought I should read it seeing as I have it. So far, it's about what is obviously quite literally a character stand-in for the author. His name is William Bradshaw, which is Christopher Isherwood's middle name, and he meets the titular Mr. Norris on a train heading to Berlin and strikes up a friendship with him, which is apparently based on a friendship that Christopher Isherwood had in real life in Berlin with a sort of elderly British gentleman. And so far, it's kind of eccentric and as wacky as you would expect 1930s Berlin to be. I'm not very far in, but it's not really a plot so far. It's just kind of different things happening in each chapter, which I'm not complaining about. I'm kind of just reading one chapter every night, and it's so short that I'll have it finished in a couple of weeks. It's actually quite a nice way to read something that's not really plot heavy. Thank you so much for watching this reading vlog. I will see you in my next video. Bye!